if there's an over-the-top turnout of Democrats in Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, that is that's almost impossible for a Republican to overcome.
Giles, he won it on that Broward alone.
There are that many Democrats in that part of the state.
Years ago,
Right, that's right.
that made this a Democratic state, were those three counties down there turning out.
And I think you can argue that it's possible that Miami-Dade carried the state for Obama, and Miami-Dade obviously carried, Obama carried Miami-Dade. There were, in 2008, Obama had a margin of 104,000 votes. This time around, 240,000 votes was his margin. So I think that kind of was, as Steve has said, they showed up. And if there's any surprise for me, the surprise was the effect of this early voting. That this, and Brent mentioned it, it was some people believe, and I think there have been some political observers who and participants in the Republican Party who have acknowledged that there was an attempt to suppress the vote using these shorter early voting times. I think that possibly worked as a backfire. And in the end, when there were people standing in line waiting to vote, and showing up to vote, and you have the power of social media as people are, sending text messages and beaming messages to their friends, that the message came across, somebody doesn't want you to vote. And I think the result of that may have brought more people to the polls in the end than maybe otherwise would have had.
Jack,
Sort of saying, if they don't want me to vote, I'm going to vote. I was on election day, I was in Central Florida in a very Puerto Rican precinct in the center of Orlando, or Central Florida, and it was fascinating. There was a steady stream of Hispanic voters, and there were people who were wheeling their elderly parents in wheelchairs so they could show up to vote. These are people who could barely speak English, but they were Puerto Rican, they could vote, and they were not going to not show up. And that was, to me, the surprising thing.
And the Florida ballot got loaded up by the legislature, which, again, I suppose a skeptic might say that, well, there's a reason for that as well, because they could, that's what led to the long lines in part, too. You got to go through all these darn constitutional amendments, and they all but three got beat. So, there's, if you're suspicious about such
No,
things,
you're not suspicious or cynical. You've only been covering government for a few years.
Yes, I like to leave cynical out, Steve, but you get highly skeptical of that, particularly when it was a pattern across the country in states where there were Republican legislatures. And
So what I'm getting out of this, just to summarize before we go to break, is that to some extent, some of the traditional means of influencing voters, big time television, a lot of, let's say, political maneuvering and so forth, voters pushed back and said, not necessarily, we're not going along with that. Does everybody kind of nod to that might have happened this year?